Today we're going to talk about fast gainers versus slow gainers. This is a topic that I haven't touched on recently, and I actually regret not really addressing this in the books that I've put out so far and in a lot of the programming videos I've made. I do plan on incorporating it in the future when I make some revisions to base strength and peak strength. For right now, I want to kind of clarify because this conceptual model can be very useful when you're trying to figure out what an appropriate training split is for you, or if you're trying to figure out maybe why a lift hasn't been moving, why you've been a little stagnant. So yesterday I did a video on comparing different training splits. I compared 5 different arrangements that are really common: full body, body part, push-pull legs, and so on. And the main difference, I mean, there's a few, but the main one is that frequency varies. A full body split is going to let you use a lot more frequency with each lift than something like a once per week body part split. How you decide to dose the amount of frequency that you prescribe is going to depend on how you as an individual respond to training. It's going to depend on what your recovery abilities are, what your tolerance is to work. And all of this can kind of be summed up in this fast or slow gainer paradigm. It's very oversimplified, so I don't want you to get lost in putting yourself into a box like you're one or the other, and it can change over time. Experience is definitely a factor. But I really started thinking about this with this question. Harry, who's a Patreon member, commented on the video, and he asked about an upper-lower event-based split that I had written about. I actually put it in base strength. And that's something that I've used when getting ready for strongman events. So it was kind of convenient. I have a main pressing day, a main lower body day where I squat and deadlift, and then an event day where I do all of my technical refinement. And that's worked well for me in the past, especially with heavy event training, because that type of work is just as, if not more taxing than your typical barbell strength work. So 3 hard days, all of my body gets hit at least twice in that split because I'm doing a press on the event day. So the farmer walks, yoke carries, bag picks, very, very posterior chain heavy. And then whatever I do, log or dumbbell pressing that opposes what my regular pressing day is. So there's still a good amount of frequency and there's still a lot of effort put out over these 3 days. Now he asked about doing it with a rotating split, almost in a block phase where, or a block approach where the 3rd day might rotate from GPP work to accessory work to event work, depending on his goals at the moment. My main concern with him when doing something like this, and I put the response directly under the comment on the Patreon page. For any of you who are members, you can check that out. But I put that basically I think the main potential with the block approach is that in a phase where you aren't doing accessory on day 3, it limits barbell training to 2 times per week. So if you're doing, let's say, GPP on day 3, then really you just have a bench and overhead day and a squat and deadlift day, and that's it. That's not a ton of work. That's actually a very low amount of work, and it may not be enough for most people. And then I went on to talk about how I didn't mention this dynamic in base strength. I plan on doing it in the future. The main thing you have to concern yourself with when attempting to do a split that isn't necessarily high frequency, and many old-timey splits, many kind of classic splits from back in the day were low frequency, and they banked on just doing a lot of work and getting a lot of fatigue built up. You are going to be a lot less likely to benefit from that type of protocol if you are a slow gainer. And I'm going to get into what this specifically means. So comparing slow versus fast gainers. Again, this is a very, very broadly generalized category. So I don't want you to think that this is like a lapel pin that you're going to get, that you're going to wear. It's going to be an identifier for you. Well, I'm this, so all of my decisions have to be X, Y, or Z. This is a broad conceptual model. It's really important that you approach it that way. But if you do use some objectivity and some reason and kind of evaluate what you've experienced in the past to what you should do next, you can get some good insight that might give you just the right maneuver you need to get those lifts moving again or solve whatever issues you're dealing with. So slow gainers generally don't get as much from a single dose of training stress. Now, this is going to sound very bro sciencey, but intuitively this makes sense. If you compare everybody, there's a bell curve that you're going to see. If you put everybody through some workout protocol, you're going to get people to get a lot out of it, and you're going to get people to get hardly anything out of it. And most people will be in the middle. Fast gainers are going to be the ones that see a single dose of stress go much farther. So imagine you take 100 people, you have them all do 5 sets of 5 with 75% of their 1 rep max. You have them do that, and then you chart what observable progress occurred from that one single dose of training. Some people will get very strong just from that single dose of training. Others might not even register, and it might not register until the weight gets heavier, or until they start doing more work, or until they accrue enough sessions for all of that fatigue to compound and for them to get an actual substantial adaptive response. So the broad rule is that fast gainers can grow off lower it's off lower frequency and effort. I really got to do a better job of editing. Typos are becoming synonymous with my brand. So fast gainers can grow off lower frequency and effort. It means they don't need quite as much work. A little dose goes a long way. Slow gainers require generally more frequency, more volume, and more effort. Josh Bryant has a beautiful analogy where he compares it to the slow kids in class. If you are not one of the gate students, if you're not one of the bright kids, you got to hit the books twice as hard. Similarly, if you don't respond quite as aggressively to training, you have to work out more often. You have to do more. Now, there's a couple of reasons for this. The main thing we have to worry about with frequency and with how hard we dose our stress is recovery. But slow gainers tend to have a little bit more margin of error. The things that make them slow gainers also mean that each dose of training isn't going to strain them as much. So they don't necessarily have to walk the same tightrope that fast gainers do with regards to watching their recovery. It's not to say that you can't overreach or that you can't do some really stupid shit that's going to set your training back, but generally it tends to be less of an issue. Starting off with fast gainers, this is the fun thing for coaches to consider. I mean, if you're not a fast gainer, you're just going to look at this with green envy, because this is what we all wish would happen when we would train, but it's a small chunk of the population. They possess traits that make each set or rep go farther. Every dose of stress goes farther. So explosive athletes, there's a reason that we utilize jumping ability, or at least in like communist countries that actually have a state-sponsored program that recruits Olympic lifting hopefuls. They line up all the 9-year-olds, see how high they can jump. Whoever jumps the highest, come with me. You're going to learn how to snatch and clean and jerk. The fact of being explosive means that your nervous system is kind of operating on another level. It means that you're a little more aggressive. It means that you're capable of putting out more force, which directly means that you're going to be imposing a bigger strain on your body with each effort. So that's kind of the dynamic that exists. Very advanced lifters, it's the same thing. Whether you're predisposed to being explosive or not, if you've been around long enough to get good, that means that over time you've taken the governor off your nervous system. So once again, you can do more with what you have, and every effort you put out carries with it a bigger recovery cost. Heavier and bigger lifters, they tend to lift the most absolute weight. So everybody's fixated on strength body weight ratios. Heavier, bigger lifters tend to get by with less total work. You're not likely to see a guy in the 165 category who's an all-time record holder who only squats once per week with medium to low volume. It's much more common, I believe, to see smaller lifters using higher frequency approaches. Enhanced lifters. Now, this is a big one. This is like the main difference with enhanced and natural lifters. Many people think that there's like different programming recommendations. There is a broad rule that you can kind of see, and that's that anybody on gear is going to see the same dose of training go a bit farther. They're going to immediately get kind of a bigger margin for error without necessarily working as hard, without living in the gym. You'll see growth. And when you do decide to live in the gym, you recover a bit better. So that's a quality that allows you to get more out of your training. If you take gear and you fuck off and you do nothing, you're going to end up with nothing. It's like whatever 5% growth you get is going to be off of the nothing you had before. So what's 5% of nothing? It really gets optimized when you utilize it as a restorative, when you utilize it to push your lifting farther. And aside from the epidemic of people doing PEDs or taking PEDs who have no business doing it, what really chaps me is that they do it the complete wrong way. So it's like the worst of both worlds. They do it while kind of fucking off on their diet. They do it without really dedicating themselves to living in the gym and getting the most out of it. And it's like, if you're not going to milk your training for all it's worth, why are you taking this step into this thing that has different risks associated with it? You would think that that's the thing that you reserve for that last push to be competitive and hang with the best around. But people use it. I mean, they do. They use it as a shortcut. It's unfortunate because not only are you not going to get a lot out of it, but you're getting all the negative sides to begin with. So the fact of hormonal enhancement, it's essentially a default way of making you into a fast gainer in some respects. And anybody else who you can think of who looks at a weight and grows is going to be considered a fast gainer. Again, in our thought model, the person who does the same amount of work as everybody else, but they get stronger, more muscular, more explosive, and they don't require as much to grow. And there's a lot of genetic determinants for that we can't even hope to get into. We can just kind of recognize that this predisposition exists. Now, there's a paradox with fast gainers because on the one hand, each rep is going to go farther, so less volume, effort, and frequency is needed to get a similar result as another lifter might experience. It's easy for higher doses of stress to lead to under recovery. So if you're a fast gainer and you're training to failure very often, or you're using very high frequency, or you're doing a shit ton of work, it's more possible for you to dig yourself into a hole and notice yourself backsliding because you've been overreaching. However, fast gainers become advanced so quickly that they end up requiring ever increasing doses of stress in order to continue growth. When you're newer or when you're less developed, anything you do is going to make you stronger in some way. When I was a teenager, I might do a shit ton of push-ups one day. I might do 20 sets of cable flies because I just wanted to really fuck my chest up. Anything I would do at that point would lend itself to growth in some way. But as you get more advanced, it's like building a house of cards. You have to concern yourself with more precision, more specialization, more focus on getting specifically to where you want to go. And that's also part of the reason that as you get stronger and stronger and stronger, it starts to carry over less to other things because now it's more about this one feat that you're oriented with as opposed to like general qualities that tend to bleed over into other things. So there's this paradox here. Fast gainers on the one hand need less stress, but they also need more stress. And how we reconcile that can get kind of tricky. The main thing is to balance growth and recovery. You want to think of every dose of training stress and every increase you might make, whether it's adding another set, pushing a set a little farther, using a little more weight, using a harder exercise variation, whatever it might be. Every dose of stress has two components you want to concern yourself with. One is a potential to make you stronger, specifically in the way that you're trying to get stronger, if you're trying to specialize and compete in one particular movement. It also has a negative recovery cost. Now, every movement, depending on you, is going to hit you a bit differently. There are some movements or some protocols that might not have a very big growth response for where you're at right now and where you're trying to get to. It might not provide a lot of carryover to the thing you're trying to train, but it might still come with a really big recovery cost. And that's the type of stuff that will suck attention away from your growth. It will suck effort out of your workouts. It will dig you into a recovery pit. And that's when it becomes a problem. Slow gainers, novices, people that are generally better off training more frequently and with more effort, they're not going to have this problem to the same degree. So as a fast gainer, as somebody who has the potential of becoming, let's say, a world-class athlete, you eventually are going to be tasked with walking this tightrope to make sure the dosage of stress is high enough and specific enough to do what you want it to do, but it's also not going to, again, put you in that recovery pit. So as you adapt to the same stress This is part of the reason stagnation sets in. As you adapt to the same stress, you get the recovery suck with no growth, because doing the same thing over and over leads to diminished returns. Just one more rep or just doing more work doesn't cut it, because it doesn't address the need for a new stimulus, or a stimulus that is most oriented towards the thing that is holding you back. So that comes into like weak point training, targeting weak areas, trying to figure out where you're deficient, focusing on that. Like the house of cards analogy I gave, all of your work has to be more specialized towards your goal the better you get. It has to be appropriately varied. You still need variation, but it has to be varied kind of just so, because remember, the same old thing and any type of work that you happen to throw together in a workout is not going to get you closer to that bench record. It has to be optimized for the growth effect while limiting recovery cost, and that's where experience and note-taking is going to be your best friend. There's really no sidestepping that. There's nothing you can do to bypass experience. You have to start now, getting your hours in, paying attention, taking notes, figuring out how every time you implement a change to your training, what the response is. And that will give you a toolbox in the future for what changes to make, what exercises to prioritize, what frequencies you can get away with, where to put your RPE, how hard should you be working, depending on what you think you can handle. So it's just as much art as science, because you're not going to have an actual flow chart that shows all this. There's too many pieces. There isn't a piece of paper big enough to take all of those things into account. But you will get a sense. Your shitty pattern recognition software that you call a brain will eventually get a very keen sense for what is appropriate when. Now, training organization, or periodization if you like, it's the best tool you have as a fast gainer or an advanced athlete to balance these things out. That's what periodization is supposed to do. It's supposed to put training in a comprehensive arrangement that maximizes growth while taking into account recovery. So short periods of overreaching can be sustained. If you go 2 or 3 weeks, you can go very hard. And as you dig yourself into that recovery pit, if you just take a short period of time to deload, that's why deloads were created. It allows you to recover, to restore, to supercompensate, and then you come back and repeat the cycle. Or if you rotate the training stress, if you utilize different movements, if you work in a different threshold, if you have lighter days that still contribute to weekly volume, but don't have the same recovery cost. There are a lot of different tricks, and it's all going to be encompassed in what you would call a periodized approach. Whether or not it's a linear approach or a block approach, doesn't matter. There's a lot of ways to periodize. The important thing is that you're taking into account as you write your programming, what you're doing for each phase, how long it's going to last for, what your timeline is, how long you can train before backsliding without changing the effort. These are all things that go into your training program. Rotating through periods of novel work is key to sidestepping stagnation. And this is what I wrote about in base strength, the whole base peak dynamic. It's basically kind of a simplified version of what a periodized macro cycle is, where you start off non-specific, you start off with a lot of work in volume and submaximal, and over time you get more specific, you get heavier, effort gets higher, the movements become more specialized. So just broadly having these 2 phases of training, whether you compete or not, going back and forth is going to expose you to not just a novel stress, but the right kind of novel stress that is oriented to where you're trying to go. So when you're programming for a fast gainer, and let's assume this is like a typical Western approach to training, the scorched earth approach. We have a long history in our training culture of being influenced by kind of general bodybuilding or recreational training type approaches. And a lot of it is just effort, accumulating fatigue within the workout. So a lot of it becomes more instinctive. A lot of it becomes more auto-regulated the day of. We don't concern ourselves with the mathematics and the calculation of the total number of lifts and average intensities and so on. We take a much more, I think, equally effective, but a much more kind of caveman approach to training. So if you are training in this style, like so many people do, where it's about the hard workout, you want less frequency of hard efforts if you're a fast gainer, or similarly if you're very advanced. Low RPE for high volume work. So if you are doing high volume work, you're going to have to dial the RPE back. A 6 or 7 RPE will get enough stimulus for you while making it sustainable to do those sets without burning you out or digging you into that recovery pit. or high RPE work can be done very infrequently. Now, this is a more common approach, and you'll see this outlined in a lot of strength or powerlifting type programs that claim to be easy to run for everybody and sustainable. And basically, they're just plotting out week to week. This is our hard workout. This is where we get all the stress. This is how much time you need to recover to do it again. And this is how many total weeks you can do it before you have to take a step back. Brian Carroll's 10-20 Life, great example of an effective program specifically for a very advanced lifter or somebody who biases towards fast gaining. It's 2 weeks on, 1 week off. And it works in kind of a linear fashion, but you have that one workout, you come in, you hit your big squat or your big press, and then the next week you come in, you build off of it. And you build off of it each session while throwing in a deload every third week. So that recovery, spacing those high RP efforts further apart is what makes it sustainable for somebody where recovery might be an issue. Frequent deloads. Again, the more advanced you are, the more frequently you can deload. You have 10-20 Life going every third week. You have the Lily Bridge program. I'm going to give an example of that later, where it's essentially every other week because you alternate between heavy and light bench days, and you alternate between heavy and light squat days and deadlift days. So that's essentially like deloading every other week. The primary emphasis for these type of lifters is making training sustainable by managing recovery. That's the most important thing. Now, more Eastern styles of training, like Olympic lifting influence type styles of training, if you think of like a Shiko template, I highly recommend you guys get the translated Shiko book that Renaissance Periodization put out. Very interesting to see how these models get broken down. Basically, when you read through it, understand that Shiko came out of the Soviet system. I believe he's a Russian master of sport. He was a very successful Olympic lifting coach and took those principles and applied it with huge success to IPF powerlifting. I believe it's the IPF he competed in. Anyways, very, very decorated powerlifting coach, trained legitimately some of the biggest monsters of all time. Very formal, very reproducible method of training. And it's based off the Olympic lifting approach, which is a lot of skill work. You're doing high frequency in Olympic lifting because you have to preserve speed and skill, and that benefits from frequent touches throughout the week. So to apply that to powerlifting, when you go in and bench, you're not just trying to blow your pecs out. You're trying to build skill and accumulate touches, and you're keeping track of the number of touches. And the math changing week to week is what coaxes growth. And you have heavy days or big days where you do a ton of work, and that has to be interspersed with smaller or medium days where you're accruing volume but still allowed to recover. And that's kind of how this goes. So that the textbook he has goes really in depth about what he's looking at when he's putting a program together. It's a different lean. It's very effective, a little harder to run, but understanding, at the very least, understanding how and why it works is important, even if you're never going to run something like that. So those types of workouts, they follow charts of optimal sets, reps, number of lifts, intensities. So they have guidelines they go off of that tend to be productive, and they can manipulate them up or down depending on what they observe with their athlete. Like I said, generally higher frequency, and the amount of work waves session to session, week to week. So I talked about bigger, smaller workouts, or if you have like a decoupled program. If you've ever stumbled across an article talking about how the Soviets decoupled volume and intensity, here in the West, we tend to associate them. High volume means low intensity, and vice versa. They actually decoupled it. So they'll have, it almost looks random. They'll have high volume, high volume, high intensity days. They might have a low volume, low intensity day. They might have a middle of both or an offset or whatever. And it almost looks random. So you might have hard days clustered together in a way that's not sustainable. But if it's only 3 or 4 workouts before you end up doing these smaller workouts, it's like this organic, or it allows for an organic type of recovery. Whereas we like to write things that look clean on paper, even though that is not actually how our body responds to stress. So it's more idealized. Now, an example, I talked about the Lily Bridge method. It's common for the biggest squatters and deadlifters to only go heavy a few times per month. When I first got into strongman, I remember talking to the middleweights who were pulling like 750, which was astronomical in my mind at that time. Now there's guys who are well into the 8s. There's a couple that are in the 9s. It's gotten absolutely stupid. But I remember talking to one of the earlier role models I had, like, man, you have such a big deadlift. You must just deadlift every day. You must do so much deadlift work. And he kind of rolled his eyes and he's like, I pull heavy twice a month. Between that, doing lighter accessory fluff, and doing the events, it's more than enough to grow. Well, it was only years later because I tried implementing that and it didn't quite work as well for me. I am not what you would call an advantaged deadlifter. But it was only years later I could look back and associate his role as a very good puller with the necessity to train this way. So it's kind of a chicken or the egg thing because you're inclined to think, oh, the way this athlete trains, that's why he's so good. But it can just as much be that he trains this way because he has to, because he is actually predisposed to being good. But that necessitates a whole bunch of other stuff. So if you have, let's say, a once per week split, I do write about this in Base Strength. Very easy to implement. I'm a big fan of 3-week waves. If you have something like 5-3-1, it's a perfect example. You go kind of light, kind of medium, kind of heavy, and then you just recycle through the whole thing. But if you follow that, especially if you throw a deload in, that's 4 weeks of training. Only 2 of the weeks are going to be really substantial. The first week after the deload is kind of getting your toe in the water. You push it a little bit the week after. You go for broke on week 3. Week 4, you deload. So 2 of the 4 weeks are substantial. That fits very nicely into this paradigm. Take it one step further, you can look at the Lilly Bridge method. Again, some of the best lifters in the world, Eric Lillibridge and his brother. It alternates heavy and light weeks. So you'll squat and deadlift on the same day, but on week 1, it'll be a heavy squat. So you hit your top set and it'll be speed deads. The next week, it'll be a heavy deadlift and it'll be speed squats. So in practice, yeah, you're touching the lift every week, but the hard efforts, the substantial efforts, every other week. So again, that's essentially the same as deloading every other week. You're at least deloading that lift every other week. Perfect for a very, very advanced lifter. Might be good for somebody who's on gear. Might be good for somebody who's very, very big, who's moving absolute high loads, or a very advanced lifter. Probably not going to be warranted for less developed lifters or slow gainers. I wrote something similar to Brandon Lilly's cube method. That's another example, rotating from heavy to volume to speed work on a 3-week wave. That means you're only doing heavy work for a lift once every 3 or 4 weeks. That's not going to be great for a slow gainer. And I think the response to something like the cube method was kind of underwhelming. You don't hear people really talk about it that much anymore. And Brandon Lilly's out hanging out with Post Malone and playing his guitar and his flip-flops anyways. But I'm sure it was a very, very good program for a certain demographic. I wrote the MRS split in my book, which is kind of similar, max, reps, speed. Good for people in a very particular pocket of training. Again, advanced, predisposed to being a fast gainer, bigger lifter. Maybe you're doing strongman work that's very taxing in its own right, and you can't go hard every week in the barbell lifts. There's a lot of reasons that it would have a good application, but for a generic, average run-of-the-mill lifter who needs to put the work in order to grow, not going to be quite as warranted. Frequency in the context of these types of splits can be increased, and you can get closer to something that almost looks like these high-frequency Eastern type programs by populating the other days with recoverable work. So it can be arbitrarily lower volume or intensity that just kind of makes it easy to recover from on its own. So it still contributes to the weekly stress without really blowing your recovery wad. You can use less taxing movements. You can do broad hypertrophy fluff work, and that's what you see. Lilly Bridge program, they have, it's like 5 sets of 20. It's enough to spur muscle growth, very, very hypertrophy focused, but it doesn't have the same systemic stress. It doesn't create the same beatdown that heavy work with the compound lifts do. So it walks this line that's very productive. Brian Carroll recommends the same thing, 10-20 life. He recommends a fluff and buff day. That is a very effective method. That's something that I've used. If you don't want to do just fluff work, if you're not the type of person who can go in and spend an hour and a half doing dumbbell and machine work, I love that stuff. To throw back to when I was a teenager and the only influence I had was like Muscle and Fitness and Arnold's Bodybuilding Encyclopedia. But I absolutely love that type of work. If you're not that person and you need barbell work, then you're going to want to include, if you decide to include a second or third day, make sure that the volume and intensity is reduced so it's sustainable, so it's manageable, and take notes. Take notes. How did that workout, that lighter workout you added in, how did that affect your next heavy session? How many weeks do you feel like it took before you had to reset? You have to pay attention or all of this is for naught. Now, slow gainers, this is going to apply to most of you. Fast gainers are definitionally going to be outliers. You're looking at probably top 10, maybe top 5% of people. The top 1% plus are going to be the ones that have these meteoric rises to world-class status within a couple years of being in the sport, regardless of how much gear you're on. 90% of the population could blast all the gear in the world, train their absolute balls off, and they're not going to get that good that fast. So the genetic predisposition is never not a primary factor. So slow gainers are going to possess traits that limit response to each set and rep. Fast gainers get more of a response out of each set and rep. Slow gainers have a limited response. Less coordinated lifters, this might be something that you're not inclined to think about. You might think it's also separate from a lot of these biological or genetic markers that I'm talking about, but I believe they're actually more correlated than you might think. If you're not very aggressive, you can think of somebody who's not very in tune with their body, kind of loppy, don't move very cleanly, have two left feet, don't really seem to have a sense of spatial awareness. That's going to be directly connected to how aggressive they are. If somebody's very uncoordinated, they probably don't engage in a lot of aggressive physical activity, which means their nervous system probably isn't putting out a lot of force, which means their hormonal environment isn't probably oriented around a really hard, aggressive physical activity. So just like the wisdom kind of goes, like if you're depressed, you think you're happy and that's what causes you to smile, but you can actually flip that on its head. If you're sad and you force yourself to smile, you inadvertently put yourself in a good mood because the association kind of works both ways. Similarly, if you're very uncoordinated, if you don't have good awareness of the muscles being used, if you don't have a good sense of your body, fixing that can, I believe, this is completely made up bro science, but I do believe this to be true, can start to set the tone for a hormonal environment, a psychological environment that is more conducive to getting stronger faster. So you want to improve coordination. Treat yourself like a machine, be a technical lifter, get as much out of your lifts as you can. Less aggressive lifters, again, not explosive, not able to liberate a lot of force production. People who tend to be a little more passive, it's harder for them to get physically aroused. Smaller framed and lower body weight lifters. This also might correlate to calorie intake. If you're not taking in a lot of calories, you're going to have a hard time responding aggressively to training. So people who are lower body fat percentage, typically people who are smaller height, lighter weight class lifters, no creatine, the people who have sworn off PEDs, lifetime drug free, you're not getting the benefit of the drugs making you kind of fast gainer status. And generally anybody who has a genetic predisposition to not growing that aggressively, given that they work just as hard as the guy next to them. Now, that being said, it's just like diet, because a lot of people will think, oh, I have a glandular problem because I eat the same as my buddy and he's skinny and I'm not, therefore it's genetic, it's out of my control. Big difference between saying I have a genetic obstacle I have to get over and saying that, oh, my genetics prevent me from being able to do this thing. All of you have the capacity to get strong. Strength is accessible to anybody. It's one of the most easily trainable things that you can work on, which is pretty cool if you think about it. But your specific circumstances might just require a little more attention, a little more effort, a little more intelligence. That shouldn't seem like a mountain standing in front of your way. That should actually be very liberating. That should be a very empowering sentiment that, oh, if I put my nose to the grindstone and I pay attention to the things that other people aren't, I can kind of go in through the back door, that I actually can go swim with the sharks if I'm just a little bit smarter about it. And then you can be an elitist like me, where you have your nose up in the air and you think about how, all of those other world record holders, all of those other world-class athletes, they're all a bunch of dum-dums. They're just genetically good. I'm the smart one. I got here the hard way. And you can, have that toxic feedback loop with the self-talk and your ego. Slow gainers, you're often going to see females kind of fall into this category. Again, this is very, very broad. There are females who are good athletes who get strong very quickly. Of all of the females, the outliers will get strong fast. I know Nadia Stowers. We had gyms that were pretty close to each other. She trains out of Big Speed and Strength. It was about 15 to 20 minutes from the gym I ran in Redlands. Nadia Stowers was, I believe, like a choir girl. She never played sports, never lifted. Within a couple of years, she's deadlifting 550 pounds. Again, it doesn't matter how much drugs somebody takes. It doesn't matter what you think they might doing that leads to that growth. The predisposition is what allows somebody to grow that strong, that fast. Without it, you're not seeing that growth. So there's still outliers, even in female populations. But females as a whole, you're looking at less testosterone, and not just testosterone. They don't have a Y chromosome. Y chromosome does a lot more than just generate testosterone. Everybody fixates on that in the gender discussion. But a Y chromosome, even with low testosterone, will still do a lot to benefit size and strength gains. And females tend to have smaller frames. So they're going to bias towards requiring more heavy touches throughout the week. Now, that's not some blanket rule that you're going to want to assign where I have my guys do 5 sets and I have my women do 8 sets. Or my guys work at 85%, my women work at 89%. That's kind of a dumb way to approach it. You should go in, if you are coaching somebody, able to identify their standing and make a good educated guess about how much work they should be doing. But you are never not on the hook. I have right here at the bottom. I should have put it in all caps. You are never not on the hook for figuring out how you respond and making adjustments accordingly. Older lifters fall into this category as well. I had somebody put a comment in about how should I be training as a 65-year-old? Well, when you're older, your neurological output is reduced. Your body doesn't want to hold on to all this extra mass. Your hormones aren't optimized for growth. All the young guys have their body saturated in testosterone and growth hormone, so they're made out of magic and rubber bands, where older people, not quite the same. Andy Baker has a really good analogy. He's put out a lot of good stuff on how to train older populations. And he basically says 90% to the elderly population is like taking out the trash. Because as you age and your physical capacities diminish, that means more of the day-to-day work that you do, stuff that you're conditioned to, is going to be kind of closer to what your limit is. That gap is going to shrink a bit. And what that means is that they can actually handle, they benefit from handling heavier work more frequently. It's kind of the opposite of the take it easy Gramps approach that you might be inclined to take. Now, the gift of the slow gainer, there's a silver lining to this. Don't think, woe is me, I got to work out 6 days a week for 2-a-days if I want to hang. Recovery tends to be less of an immediate threat to progress. That means you get a lot more play in the joints, which is kind of a cool thing because a hard part of programming is finding this balance of stress and recovery, of meaningful stress, while still being able to recover and not dig yourself in that pit, especially as you get more advanced and those really competitive bucket list goals start to show themselves on the horizon. So more liberties can be taken with hard efforts, high training volume, high frequencies. Growth can very much be more straightforward, but you have to be willing to work. There's no way around it. Now, if you're programming for a slow gainer, and it's probably in your best interest to assume you're a slow gainer. Fast gainers find themselves out very quickly. I've been lifting for 2 months and have a 300-pound bench press. I got very good relative to my peer group very fast. You'll find that out about yourself really quick. What's infinitely more common is people putting in time in the gym, getting frustrated because they're not seeing the gains that they wanted to see. Frequency is the most powerful tool you have for a slow gainer. Recovery is going to be trickier with high frequency, but novices and slow gainers have that bigger margin for error. And there's plenty of time to figure out the details by the time you get advanced. So don't worry about walking that tightrope. Get the work in and then make adjustments on the fly. Lifting it's like being in a whitewater rapids course. You have to make adjustments as you go. You don't have the benefit of stopping every time you stumble and going back to the finish line. You have to make these decisions in real time. You have to adjust as you go based on the feedback you get in the moment. Working sets should be generally harder effort, not necessarily to failure each set, although there's some situations where I could see that as being doable. Working sets, 8 to 9 RPE, it's going to be hard enough that you're taxing yourself, but still not all the way balls out to failure. So you should be still able to keep a good technical foundation. And you should bias towards more working sets. 4 to 6 is a good number. I was doing 5 sets of like 8 to 10 exercises last year, but then again, I was willing to stay in the gym for 3 hours a day. I don't consider myself a fast gainer, but I do get strong very quickly when my calories are high, which is most of the time, which is why I'm always kind of fat. And also PED use that is intermittently part of my competitive schedule does allow me to get more out of each training stress, but each bit of training stress. But what I found was that in order to get growth, I found myself in that trap where I needed more work to be able to keep growing, but I also had to make it sustainable because I also needed more recovery. I found that higher efforts more total working sets, but with easier exercises. So I was doing a lot of bodybuilding. That was a fluff and buff stuff, but it turned out to be very productive for me. If I tried to do all that with the big compound movements, I think I would have fallen apart. Now, there are people on the other end, again, natural lifters, smaller, less developed, or people who generally don't grow as fast. You are going to want to temper yourself to more working sets with harder efforts. And even AMRAPs are great. Not all the time, but there's no reason why the last compound set of the day you can't do for a set of 10 or 12 with a good amount of effort. And deloads should be less frequent. That doesn't mean they should be non-existent. Don't bank on being able to go ham every week. You still need to take into account periods of overreaching or where you start to get stagnant with the same type of work and you need to clear out, resensitize yourself. Schedule deloads based on need. Don't just arbitrarily do it every fourth week. Most people take deloads before they earn them. And that's just as big of a problem because it can lead to detraining. If you're a slow gainer and you're deloading every third or fourth week and you don't need to, that could be a huge reason why you're not stacking progress week to week. So thank you so much for paying attention. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. I'm going to be doing a lot more slide presentations like this. I feel like it's an easier way for me to collect my thoughts and not ramble like I was doing in previous videos and podcast episodes. So stay tuned for that. I'm going to put most of them up in a PDF form, so you'll be able to click on a link and download the actual slides for your own personal use and reference. And that'll be available on my website. And sponsorship. This episode, like all of my episodes, are sponsored by you. It is through you guys, the support you've given me. Anytime somebody gets a free personalized from scratch training template, they send me a questionnaire, $97. I put together a fully fleshed out 12-week program, top to bottom, answer any questions you have. Anytime somebody signs up for mentorship or coaching, where I give weekly workouts and do video review and prepare you for whatever immediate goals you have, or anytime you guys buy one of my books or spreadsheets, it supports me, and that's what allows me to do this full time. So thank you so much for all of that support. It is much appreciated. Please leave your questions and comments in the comment box. Consider checking out Patreon. If you do want to support me, I have a $5 tier. Buy me a cup of coffee for the month. And in return, I give direct engagement. I answer direct questions. Most of those questions are actually what I used to make videos off of. And I actually upload all of my training for the week. I record every stupid set that I do. I give commentary. So if you want to see how I run things, you can see it there. Also, check out the Facebook page. The Base Strength Facebook page is absolutely free. We got about 1,100 members. And a lot of them actually, they're pretty smart. They give some good advice. I'm really pleased with the environment. It's not like the powerlifting motivation chat or some of the other oversaturated, really shitty Facebook groups that you see that are just absolute shit shows. So I'm really happy with the way this community is growing. That's enough of me bloviating about all of that. Thank you so much for your support, guys. Till next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.